Welcome to another episode of WireWheel's Privacy Roll-Up, a weekly recap of newsworthy privacy updates from our Chief Privacy Officer, Rick Buck. Hi, Rick. How are you today?
I'm great, Janine. How are you?
I'm doing well. It looks like we have some really interesting stories to cover today. So let's jump right in. I hear there's been some activity around privacy in the EU's regulation on artificial intelligence. There seems to be a lot of layers to artificial intelligence. So I'm really interested to hear how the EU's newly drafted changes to the privacy regulations will impact businesses, consumers. So what's the latest in that space?
Yeah, it's really interesting, Janine. I'm glad you raised this question. Machine learning, artificial intelligence, automated decision-making, profiling is becoming the norm in the way data is processed these days. And the Europeans, once again, are leading the charge on presenting consumer-centric privacy legislation. The legislation, which they're referring to as the regulation, is now under consideration by the EU Parliament and the Council of the European Union, who's going to create a conversation around this together with the European Commission. The three of these legislative bodies will be working together to finalize what they hope will be a law that comes to fruition. These things tend to take a while, but we'll see how fast this progresses. What's interesting here is that in many respects, the regulation speaks to a lot of things that GDPR already talks about, right? So GDPR, as everybody knows, applies to the processing of personal data for people in the EU, and it applies to AI systems if personal data is being used. Also, currently under GDPR, GDPR requires consent for profiling and for automated decision-making. So a lot of that is kind of already covered. GDPR has some legal requirements, right, about automated decision-making. They talk about things like fairness, so people being discriminated against by the use or not use of their data, transparency about the use of their data, and a right to human intervention, meaning people have the right to be able to challenge an automated decision-making, an automated decision that was made by them. So what's new under the regulation? So GDPR, many people would say, is pretty stringent. The regulation is coming at this from a more specific point of view. It's putting obligations on the vendors of AI systems. It's putting obligations on the users of AI systems. The vendors are the people that make the technology. The users are the people, quite obviously, that use the technology. Mm-hmm. And it's calling out prohibitions on high-risk uses of decision-making. And it has a lot more requirements for high-risk uses than GDPR does. So while GDPR imposes, let me say that differently, while GDPR imposes requirements about data processing activities, it doesn't actually prohibit them. The regulation is going to prohibit high-risk activities. And high-risk activities from a profiling point of view, from an AI point of view, are going to include things like the use of data by public authorities or law enforcement, exploiting vulnerable populations of people, making real-time or after-the-fact biometric decisions, using things like facial recognition. On the HR side, making decisions about job screening or evaluating candidates, or for employees about their promotions or terminations or monitoring their performance, and things like that. And so the regulation will talk very specifically about how companies will have to comply in order to be able to use the data for those kinds of purposes. So they're calling these things high-risk assessments. And from a high-risk point of view, some of the requirements are talking about things like establishing a risk management system. So basically what you're doing is putting together a formal plan of what it does, how it works, and what the risks are against how you're processing data. To be able to provide training and validation and testing of the data models to make sure that they're accurate. to provide technical documentation before the system is even built to make sure that the system complies with the regulation, to create logs that track what you're doing with the data, to ensure transparency, to make sure that the output is being used appropriately and that end users have access to that information. And of course, to be able to enable human oversight to make sure that if the system is causing risks to health or safety or fundamental rights, that the logic behind that can be changed. Another interesting part about this is that the regulation is going to establish a European Artificial Intelligence Board. So their purpose is going to be to issue guidance, to make sure that there's a constant application being used for the regulation, to make sure that best practices and standards are established and enforced and used. In addition to there being this Artificial Intelligence Board, there'll also be representation from each of the European Union states. So they're really looking at this from a holistic point of view. From a penalty point of view, it's got some real teeth. Penalties range from as low as 10 million euros or 2% of your worldwide annual turnover. And annual turnover is your gross revenue. All the way up to, in some circumstances, up to 30 million euros or 6% of your total annual worldwide turnover. And that's far more expensive than GDPR is currently. The good news is that it's going to have, if it comes to fruition, it's going to have an implementation period of 24 months. And it's going to have a 12-month, so 24 months for new implementations. Mm-hmm. And it's going to have a 12-month transition period for companies that are already utilizing AI systems that are in place. So there's a lot to be said about this. I love that the Europeans are thinking about the consumer first, the individual first. Will the way in which this works become too burdensome for companies to comply with? We'll see. But the fact that they are drawing a line in the sand around this, I think, is it's great. And as we saw with GDPR, as it goes, Europe goes the rest of the world. It's a huge market. Mm-hmm. And as a result of European legislation, we've seen the world change in Canada with their castle legislation. We've seen the world change here in the United States with our state legislation. California, Virginia, Washington, others have followed sort of in the footsteps and under the overall umbrella guidance presented by the GDPR. So lots to be said there.
Yes, a lot of layers and a lot of time, right?
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how those that are actually employing artificial intelligence now are actually going to have to make major changes in compliance and rules. So
yep,
that's great. Well, thanks for that update. That's a lot. I'm going to be following that one. So let's talk a little bit about the latest on Apple's new iOS 14.5 app tracking transparency requirements. That was a mouthful, but looks like it's being released this week. And it sounds like developers are now mandated to ask for permission to track users for targeting advertising.
Yeah, so I would say don't pour yourself a big cold glass of milk for this one, because cookies are on their way out. Apple, Google, other industry advocates are all coming at the cookieless transition out of a third-party cookie world. We've heard a lot about Apple iOS 14.5. It's being released today. And the technology behind it is their app tracking transparency requirement, better known as ATT. And in short, as you just mentioned, it's mandating that developers ask permission to track users for targeted advertising. So before you download an app that will have tracking capabilities on it, you'll have to give permission to the app owner for that to happen. And if you currently have apps that have tracking on it, they'll be required to get that permission from you. As I said, others like Google are thinking about how they're going to be moving to a cookieless world. As most people know, Google's established this think tank, that's Google Privacy Sandbox, They've got a specific technology called the federated learning of cohorts, better known as Flock. That is their attempt to be able to disable the use of third-party cookies. You'll be put into anonymous groups of cohorts. I can't say the word. Cohorts. Thank you. That will then be sold off for targeting purposes. The whole focus on Google's side of this thing again is the elimination of third-party cookies. They're touting this as a technology that's going to reduce advertising fraud and increase performance metrics and reducing CAPTCHAs and things like that. Their whole goal is to do this without having a negative impact on the industry. Apple is saying many of the same things. They're saying that this the changes in iOS 14 are privacy-forward enhancements. They're meant to protect their users' privacy, mostly because it forces the app publishers to get their consent before doing that. What's going to happen, and I sort of alluded to this, is that Apple users will be presented with a one-time notification. It'll be a pop-up. It'll ask for permission to use the identifier for advertisers, otherwise known as IDFA, for tracking, and give the end user a choice to opt out of sharing that IDFA for the app. This was actually always available as a choice, but you can drill down deep into your privacy settings to be able to do that. And now this is being, a privacy by design sort of approach that Apple is taking to this technology. Of course, the opposing view, much like the opposing view on Google's approach, is that while this is a privacy-forward change, that making this change will reduce the number of Apple app users from allowing their IDFA to be shared with the app publishers. And as a result of that, the publishers and the ad tech industry's ad revenue is going to take a big hit. So we'll see where that goes. Outside of the tech companies, there are the industry associations that are coming at this as well. We have the W3C, who is working on their privacy community working group. We've got the Partnership for Responsible Addressable Media, known as PRAM. They're working on things to safeguard privacy and consumer experiences. The IAB Tech Lab is working on their Project REARC. And of course, the Trade Desk, as everybody knows, is working on their Unified ID 2.0. All of this is in an effort to change the playing field, to be able to eliminate the use of third-party cookies, to be able to, again, shift as we were talking about with AI in the first conversation, to shift the power back to the consumer, to be able to make educated choices about how their data is used and how they're targeted. One thing is for certain, notice and choice and consent about the collection and use of people's personal information is changing. It's becoming more prevalent. We're seeing it in legislation across the world. Will this change ubiquitously be defined by legislation? Will it be industry standards? Will it be some technology play? Will it be some combination of both? Of any of those remains to be seen. But the way in which advertisers are now looking at collecting data, using data, and targeting their customers certainly is on the precipice of a big change. So big news for today for Apple.
Oh, definitely big news. And, again, something to continue to watch because it's starting to unfold. So a lot going on there. So, okay, our last topic. Let's pivot for a moment to, pending state privacy regulations for this week. It sounds like Florida's HB 969 privacy bill passed the House on April 21st. Likelihood of it passing through the committee's negotiations?
Yeah, so Florida now joins 20 plus states with, I believe, 24, if I'm correct, different state laws that are being proposed all around data privacy. Florida is got two bills that are on the floor. This past week, this bill in particular was reintroduced for a third time. Wow. It looks a lot like CCPA. It looks a little bit like GDPR. It comes to the table with a similar but slightly different window for who it applies to. It's $50 million in annual revenue. If you receive data from 50,000 consumers or more for targeted advertising, or if you get half of your revenue from selling data, right? It looks a lot like California. It has a slightly broader definition of targeted advertising. It has a private right of action, which is making people uncomfortable. Unlike, it's a little more forgiving than some of the other laws in that where many of the laws that are being introduced now have a 30-day cure window. Florida has a 45-day cure window, but it has similar penalties. It has similar requirements. It has similar but slightly different consumer rights. It is yet just another one of the many state bills, along probably with our friends in Alaska and potentially our friends in Washington who will pass a bill. How this will end up, which of their two bills is the one that survives and comes to fruition, remains to be seen. How many more state bills, and I've said this on our weekly calls in the past, how many more of our state bills are going to be introduced, and how much pressure that exerts at the federal level to come up with a universal and preemptive state law, all remains to be seen. It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. The good news is, the companies like WireWheel are to help people manage through that, and we have the tools to help you guys comply with the law, and when new laws come into place, the flexibility to be able to incorporate those kinds of requirements. So a lot going on, and never a dull moment in privacy world.
Well, hey, I love it. As you said, WireWheel has the solutions to be able to, help companies in that space. So that's a great thing. Well, I want to thank you again for this week's update, Rick. And also want to thank our viewers for tuning in to WireWheel's weekly privacy roll-up. If you do have any privacy questions you'd like to ask us, just reach out to us at marketing@wirewheel.io, and you'll also be able to find the link in the description. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to WireWheel's YouTube channel as well. So thanks, everyone. Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Janine. Thanks, everybody, for listening. See you next week.